Under a sky heavy with storm clouds and symbolism, the air above Alberta hung motionless, as if the atmosphere itself knew what was coming. Deep in the remote Canadian Rockies, where signal fades and silence rules, world leaders descended into a summit that was never really meant to succeed. They arrived in armored convoys under RCMP lockdown, escorted not by anticipation but by apprehension. The G7 was always more theater than unity, but this time the curtain didn't rise. It was torn clean off. Something happened in those mountains, something no one expected, and it started before the first handshake was refused. The usual rituals, photos, protocols, joint declarations vanished like vapor in cold alpine air. Before Air Force One even touched Canadian soil, Prime Minister Mark Carney did the unthinkable. He killed the closing communiqué. Not postponed, not amended, killed. That document, a pillar of G7 consensus since 1975, was meant to symbolize unity in trade, security, and global values. This time it became a diplomatic corpse. No signatures, no policies, no unity. Just a vacuum. A deliberate silence where the voice of the free world was supposed to echo. And the world noticed. Macron's team called it unprecedented. A German official whispered it was tactical silence. And as Trump disembarked from Air Force One, armed with new tariffs, outrageous demands, and even a veiled suggestion of annexing Canada, yes, annexing, there was no friendly handshake awaiting him. Only resistance. Subscribe now, because what happened next is rewriting the rulebook of diplomacy, and this may be the last time anyone bothers printing one. Trump had come to Alberta with fire in his eyes. He demanded 5% GDP military budgets across NATO, fresh tariffs against Europe, and floated new economic sovereignty clauses that undermined the very system the G7 was built to protect. He even resurrected the ghost of buying Greenland, a fantasy he aired on Fox News just weeks earlier, which had already outraged Denmark and now summoned Macron into the Arctic in a theatrical rebuke. The French president detoured to Greenland unannounced just hours before arriving in Canada. Flanked by Danish PM Mette Frederiksen, Macron delivered a message to Trump before the summit even began. Greenland is not for sale. Europe will not be leveraged. While Macron staged symbolic defiance with press conferences and polar photo ops, Carney played a colder game. No drama, just erasure. The communiqué was replaced with a sterile chair's summary. That's not just a formatting change, it's a statement. One that denies Trump the stage. One that strips Washington of the ability to weaponize the summit for domestic PR. One that ensures no document emerges bearing Trump's signature. No headline reading, G7 backs U.S. vision. The void became the verdict. Inside the summit, what unfolded was less cooperation, more containment. Germany's Friedrich Merz arrived under pressure. Berlin is bleeding a $17.5 billion export shortfall due to Trump's new auto tariffs. Japan's Shigeru Ishiba came bracing for a renewed steel probe. Britain's Keir Starmer, fresh off a razor-thin election win, secured a one-year exemption on digital trade, but no protection for finance. Mexico brought legal shields in case Washington doubled its cross-border duties, and Modi, he came trailing RCMP investigations linking his government to targeted political violence in Canada. They didn't come to build alliances, they came to survive them. In private, Carney's team had already signaled to Bloomberg that this wasn't a mere protest. It was a policy realignment. After Trump imposed a 10% universal tariff, touching $1.1 trillion in allied imports, including Canadian aluminum, lumber, and dairy, Ottawa had no intention of lending legitimacy to what it saw as coercion cloaked in diplomacy. According to Statistics Canada, just in Q1 2025, those tariffs cost Canada's manufacturing $4.2 billion, and behind closed doors, Canadian envoys were still negotiating in Washington, fighting to protect critical mineral exports, nickel, lithium, rare earths, from U.S. regulatory sabotage. And yet the summit was not just economic conflict. It was personal, a stage of grudges. Trump's Ohio campaign speech in March, where he said, "Canada should have been part of the U.S. from the start," ignited fury in Ottawa. Former Canadian defense chiefs called it imperial rhetoric. But Trump didn't back down. Instead, he escalated, proposing tariffs as a form of sovereignty enforcement, as if policy was punishment, not negotiation. Meanwhile, Macron wasn't finished. His media blitz framed France, and by proxy the EU, as defenders of democratic sovereignty. Strategic handshakes, symbolic interviews, and timed leaks buried Trump's talking points before he could even open his mouth. Did Macron shield Europe, or did he bait Washington into global isolation? Because that's what's truly unfolding here: isolation, fragmentation, breakdown. The World Bank downgraded global growth by 0.7%, citing U.S. trade volatility as a primary driver. Global capital inflows dropped 12.4% in Q1 2025. The economic system is convulsing, and the summit meant to calm the storm has become its lightning rod. In the middle of all this, Carney's voice cut clean through the fog. He refused Trump's NATO demands. Canada will not use its federal budget as a metric of military compliance, he said. That line was a shot across the bow, not just against Washington's economics, but against its worldview. Max Bergman of CSCS called Carney's maneuver a masterclass in control. No press conference, no performance, just silence, weaponized. And now, halfway through this political avalanche, I'll ask you again. If you want to stay ahead of what comes next, subscribe to this channel and like this video, because what's coming next might not be covered by your usual newsfeed. Because let's be clear, this wasn't a one-off standoff. It was the unveiling of a new world order in real time. The European Union, now operating under automatic tariff retaliation systems, triggered emergency protocols the second Trump hinted at a 17% machinery levy. Japan filed WTO complaints over aluminum. Mexico arrived with legal memoranda already prepped. Canada just erased the script. Even India's presence added friction. RCMP investigations into potential state-linked violence in Toronto made Modi's attendance diplomatically radioactive. The summit devolved from economic discussion into crisis management. As one former G7 negotiator told the Globe and Mail, "It's not a summit, it's parallel damage control." Every country defended its position, not from adversaries, but from supposed allies. And all of them pointed to one source of instability: Washington. And what is the United States doing while the world recoils? It's not apologizing, it's not negotiating, it's doubling down. Since the start of Trump's second term, the U.S. has imposed tariffs on $1.3 trillion in imports and revoked 6 major bilateral trade exemptions. Retaliation, uncertainty, volatility, that's the new North Star of American policy. And Carney didn't let it go unchallenged, with no joint pressers, no final statement, and no agreed direction. The Canadian Prime Minister didn't just mute the microphone. He turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and locked the doors. His message was simple: if you want chaos, you're not getting cover for it here. In those mountains, where access roads were sealed, protesters held at bay by 50-mile perimeters, and security enforced a lockdown not seen since the 2002 G8. Control was everything, but not to protect, to isolate, to freeze the narrative, and to let silence speak volumes. What is the G7 now, if not a hollow mirror? One that reflects not unity, but fracture. Macron performs sovereignty. Carney denies validation. Germany braces, Japan pleads, Britain hedges. Mexico prepares lawsuits. And Trump, he keeps setting fires. Fires that now burn the very institution meant to prevent them. So what happens next when a chair refuses to close a meeting and a president tries to blow the summit doors off the hinges? What happens when allies become adversaries and every handshake becomes a trapdoor? This wasn't the climax. This was the warning shot. If this silence can change diplomacy, wait until the next summit. Wait until NATO, where budgets become battlegrounds, where 5% military spending demands aren't suggestions but ultimatums, and where diplomacy might finally snap. So don't blink, because the real story is just beginning. And if you made it this far, like the video and subscribe right now. because next time, the room might not even have chairs. Then came the ripple effect, less visible on the surface but far more dangerous beneath. Like the silent shift of tectonic plates before an earthquake, the summit's void began to destabilize everything surrounding it. Finance ministers returning home weren't carrying new policy frameworks, they were carrying questions, and not the rhetorical kind. What happens when no agreement is better than a bad one? What happens when a summit designed to prevent global economic collapse becomes the warning sign of one? Because make no mistake, that's what this is. Not a misstep, not a failure of communication, but a recalibration of how the world measures power and who gets to use it. And then there's the question no one dares say aloud. But every delegation is thinking, is the G7 even relevant anymore? For decades, it stood as the command center of post-war economic architecture, a firewall against chaos. Now, it looks like a stage without a script. Who's writing the next chapter? China, with its parallel BRICS plus institutions and quiet debt diplomacy. The EU, trying desperately to present a united front even as it fractures within. Or maybe no one at all. Maybe we're entering a phase where chaos isn't the threat, it's the strategy. There's a chilling genius in how Carney handled it. He didn't fight Trump with tweets. He didn't hold grandiose speeches. He didn't leak documents. He simply refused to play the game. That refusal created a black hole at the center of the summit, a vacuum of legitimacy, of validation, of narrative. And into that vacuum, every other leader began pouring their own stories. Macron as the defender of sovereignty, of Starmer as the last hope for digital common ground, Ishiba as the silent guardian of Japan's trade integrity. Even Merz, under immense pressure from German industry, started threading public concern into quiet policy shifts. They all moved, not because they agreed, but because someone else refused to move at all. But what if Carney's silence wasn't just defiance? What if it was a blueprint? Because in a world of overexposed leaders and constant information warfare, silence may be the only message that lands. The lack of a communique meant no one had to sign on to someone else's disaster. No one had to stand next to Trump for a photo. No one had to explain to their parliaments why they co-signed economic aggression. And most importantly, no one had to acknowledge U.S. leadership as credible. That's not just clever. That's revolutionary. Ask yourself, when was the last time an entire summit unraveled not with a scandal, not with a bombshell, but with nothing? No signatures, no slogans, just a shared, deliberate absence. It's as if the G7 staged its own funeral, and every leader showed up not to mourn, but to quietly calculate their escape. Subscribe right now if you're beginning to see the shape of what's coming, because the next moves won't be on camera. They'll be in closed-door trade blocks, quiet currency swaps, and military cooperation agreements signed without fanfare. There are whispers now, in corridors once reserved for cautious optimism. Whispers that the G7 is done, that this summit in the icy quiet of Alberta was not a failure, it was a transition, a metamorphosis from what once was to what must now replace it. Already, analysts in Berlin and Paris are suggesting a pivot toward G10 configurations, BRICS plus engagements, and regional security clusters that don't involve Washington at all. Is this paranoia, or is it preparation? And where does that leave the United States? With a legacy of dominance, yes. With unmatched military reach, yes. But with partners who now flinch every time a U.S. president speaks of economic sovereignty. That phrase, once just diplomatic jargon, now reads like a warning label. Tariffs are no longer tools, they're weapons. Summits are no longer discussions, they're fortresses. And allies are starting to look a lot more like reluctant neighbors than trusted friends. And here's the part. No one wants to confront. What if Trump's real goal isn't unity at all? What if division is the objective? Chaos the method? If that's true, then Carney didn't derail the summit. He sidestepped a trap. Because imagine what a signed communique would have looked like. Trump on the cover, flanked by scowling world leaders, headlines reading, global endorsement. Carney removed that headline from history. He turned the page before it could be written, but the story's far from over. NATO is next. And if you thought the 5% defense spending demand was tough talk, wait until it's a funding ultimatum tied to trade access, digital rights, or energy corridors. What happens when spending becomes a loyalty test? What happens when compliance becomes currency? Canada has already said no. Europe is circling the wagons. Japan is preparing its own trade firewall. Mexico is drafting new legal armor. And yet, the United States presses on, unapologetic, unyielding, unrestrained. Behind closed doors, insiders whisper about a different kind of G7, not one hosted in official buildings, but one emerging through alternative frameworks, small, nimble alignments between countries with shared interests in critical minerals, AI governance, Arctic security, and even pandemic preparedness. These aren't formal alliances yet, but they're forming, and they're doing so outside Washington's line of sight. Could Carney's silent rebellion be the spark that burns down the old architecture and clears the way for a new one? Could the refusal to sign a communiqué become the signal that it's time for smaller, smarter, more adaptable coalitions to take the reins? Could Macron's Arctic performance be the first move in a sovereignty arms race that plays out not in tanks, but in treaties? Ask yourself, when every handshake becomes theater, and every summit turns into a stage for resistance, who is really leading? Who is setting the rules? And more importantly, who is ready to break them? We're not at the end yet, but we're past the point of pretending this is normal. And if you think silence isn't loud, you haven't been listening closely enough. What Mark Carney did in Alberta wasn't passive. It was a scalpel to the structure of consensus. And now that the incision's been made, what spills out next could redefine how nations relate, not just for a year, but for a generation. Like and comment your thoughts, because if this story makes you uneasy, it should. That unease means you're paying attention. And trust me, you'll want to be here when the next chapter unfolds. Subscribe now, because we're just getting started. And now the world stands in the aftermath, not of an explosion, not of a grand declaration, but of a silence so deliberate it shook the foundations of international diplomacy. Alberta is no longer just a location on a map. It is now a symbol, a pivot point, the place where the G7 lost its script and found its fracture. In the weeks since, governments across the globe have been scrambling to interpret what really happened behind those closed doors. Was it strategy? Was it sabotage? Or was it the first coordinated rejection of a global system that no longer serves its members equally? Because while the headlines faded, the consequences have only just begun to unfold. Trade ministries from Brussels to Tokyo are no longer treating U.S. tariffs as negotiation tactics. They're treating them as a permanent condition. Quietly, new models are being tested. The EU is experimenting with digital trade corridors that completely bypass North American data centers. France and India are exploring joint development funds for alternative green tech pipelines that exclude U.S. contractors entirely. Even the United Kingdom, long tethered to American policy under the guise of the special relationship, has begun laying legal groundwork for tariff opt-outs and secondary treaties with Commonwealth nations. This isn't rebellion, it's insurance. And what of financial markets? Already the bond markets have shown signs of decoupling. Multinational funds that once parked billions in dollar-denominated assets have begun diversifying into baskets that include yuan, euro, and even gold-backed reserves. In the last 90 days alone, 2 major global banks have moved to restructure sovereign risk exposure around U.S. policy volatility. That's not a rumor, that's money moving, and money doesn't panic. It plans. There's growing speculation that a shadow G10 is forming, not officially, not on paper, but through a growing rhythm of side meetings, off-the-record calls, and memorandums of understanding. Canada, France, Germany, Japan, the UK, India, Mexico, South Korea, Brazil, and South Africa, all quietly building networks around shared vulnerabilities, climate tech, cybersecurity, rare earth supply, vaccine sovereignty. The topics aren't ideological, they're strategic, practical, real, and the one country absent from these new alignments, the one that was once at the center of everything, the United States. But this isn't just about trade flows or fiscal policies. This is about something deeper, trust. And that trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. The institutions that defined the post-war order relied on more than treaties. They relied on predictability, on decorum, on the illusion that even in disagreement, there was mutual respect. That illusion shattered in Alberta. When a summit ends without a statement, without a photo, without even the pretense of agreement, it leaves behind a void. And that void, like nature itself, does not stay empty for long. It invites challengers. It invites alternatives. It invites risk. And risk is exactly what we're seeing now. In the Indo-Pacific, Chinese naval activity has ramped up not just in the South China Sea, but near Arctic waters, a move unthinkable just 2 years ago. In Africa, BRICS development forums are signing mineral rights contracts that would have gone to G7-backed consortiums a decade earlier. In Latin America, a quiet tech race is unfolding, with Chinese-built AI labs now outpacing U.S. investment 3-1. None of this is accidental. None of this is disconnected. These are the ripples from a summit that didn't end. It simply detonated silently and sent shockwaves through every assumption global leaders once held sacred. And let's talk about NATO. Because the G7 may have fallen into silence, but NATO is marching straight into sound and fury. Trump's 5% GDP military spending demand is not just a number. It's a test of loyalty. It's a pressure point. And already we're seeing cracks. Italy has said it cannot comply without gutting public health care. Spain warns of economic collapse if pushed. Even Germany, long considered a pillar of Atlantic unity, is signaling it will prioritize industrial subsidies over defense hikes. This isn't defiance. This is desperation. Because in the real world, budgets don't lie. And what happens when a military alliance fractures under the weight of incompatible economic realities? What happens when countries no longer ask whether the United States will lead, but whether it should? In Alberta, the question wasn't answered, it was amplified. And now, with every passing week, that question echoes louder in capital cities that once never dared to ask it at all. Are we looking at the end of American hegemony? Not in a dramatic collapse, not in a single decisive moment, but in a slow, deliberate unbundling, one summit, one sanction, one skipped signature at a time. Power doesn't always die with a bang. Sometimes it just stops being invited to the meetings that matter. And this isn't about Trump alone. He may have lit the match, but the fuel was already there. Years of unilateral actions, ignored alliances, weaponized trade, broken climate commitments. The erosion was steady. Alberta just revealed the cracks to the world. And now that those cracks are visible, no amount of press releases will plaster them over. The foundation must change, or fall. What comes next? Will we see a splintered world, governed by dozens of mini alliances and overlapping compacts? Will new institutions rise from the ashes of the old, less idealistic, but more adaptable? Or will we spiral into a new era of transactional diplomacy, where power is bought, not shared? These questions aren't theoretical anymore. They are being debated right now, inside ministries, inside militaries, and yes, inside corporate boardrooms. And the only certainty? This new era won't wait for anyone to catch up. So if you've followed this far, if you've seen how silence became strategy, how absence became influence, how one act of quiet defiance cracked the foundation of a global institution, then now is the moment to act. Like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to this channel because we're going deeper into what comes next, into the fault lines being drawn, into the new world that's forming while the old one collapses behind closed doors. History is no longer made by signatures. It's made by silence. And those who understand that will write the next chapter. Stay with us, because it's already being written,